Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Hi, good people. Welcome back to A Fork in Time. This is Chris Coppola sitting here in the host chair, and I am joined by Dylan and Evan. Evan, I know you've got an intro, and we're still working on something for Dylan.
That's
you want to say
true.
hi?
Yeah, let's do it. Hey, how's it going? It's your boy, Evan.
And Dylan?
Just going to go ahead and get the obligatory Bass Pro Shop reference out of the way. Bass Pro Shop Pyramid. It's in Memphis. Chris is going to make fun of me for it.
Look at listen to the catalog, people. I made the first reference to it, and then it's been Evan. Every time since then, it has been Evan, and he owns that.
I can own that 100%, but I only did it because I knew if I didn't do it, you would do it.
Maybe. So today we're talking about Dylan. Do you want to go ahead and set up the fork for this episode?
Yeah. So thanks to a suggestion in the Discord, and this is one that's actually been percolating for a little while. We've had some suggestions from a couple people. Helena Nash is one. We've had a couple other suggestions about it. But basically, we are traveling back. This is going to be one of our episodes for you listeners across the pond. I'm sure you're probably going to be driven crazy because this is three Americans talking like they know something about merry old England. So we are traveling back into the 1600s.
An England episode without Alexis?
Yes.
What is this sorcery?
She can only judge us after the fact. We'll be spared her wrath for whatever incorrect statements we make today. We are going to explore an idea about one of the most famous or infamous figures in British history, English history, Oliver Cromwell. He became the Lord Protector of the Commonwealth of England in the aftermath of the English Civil Wars, after they did the yet another proud English tradition and cut several kings' heads off. The idea is, what if before Oliver Cromwell rises to prominence in, the sort of Game of Thrones-esque wilderness that is the English Civil War, during a period before this, he had fallen on hard times and at one point actually considered emigrating to what was then the burgeoning colonial English settlements in New England, in the Americas. So we're going to explore the idea of what if Oliver Cromwell had decided to pull the trigger on something that he actually thought about doing and apparently was denied permission to do in our timeline, which is move his immediate Cromwell family over to the Connecticut area. So
in other words, we have a Connecticut Yankee not in King Charles Court.
I think that's our episode title.
There you go. Yeah, no, I think it is interesting about this fork, though. It's like sometimes you don't know what the ripple effects of a given decision will be. But in our timeline, what we can see is because the government basically told Cromwell you can't go, it didn't end up working out for them in the long run. So I think that's something that's really interesting about this possibility.
Just to put this out there, thinking back at the history of like the Massachusetts Bay Colony and other New England settlements, that's kind of why New England is a thing, because it's kind of where the English establishment, Episcopal Church, sends people that object, sends people that aren't falling in line. Let's just dump them in New England.
England kind of likes doing that. I mean, heck, they had an entire continent basically as a prison colony, Australia. And then we also have like this religious, New England colony where a lot of the Puritans ended up.
That's actually how Georgia started as well.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. So I think something that I find most interesting about this potential fork, and this is something that Which, by the way, I'll just take a step back and say this was more of an episode that we're kind of spitballing. We're just kind of, we did a little bit of frantic Googling here and there before we hopped on the air. But this one, I think, is going to be a little bit of a more speculative and specious episode. But I'm all for those. Because, sometimes those can end up creating some of the craziest, wackiest, most fun arcs and moments on the show versus when we do like intense, 3 weeks of scholarly research, just letting the dust from ancient texts and tombs settle into our brains. But something that I think is interesting about this arc is the interplay between Cromwell and Thomas Fairfax, in the early stages of the English Civil War. And, if you know anything about Thomas Fairfax, you understand that he's much more of a, let's say, distinguished English gentleman. And he was much less in favor of the whole, let's make a statement and execute King Charles I. Thomas Fairfax is a pretty brilliant military mind and was pretty important early on in the English Civil War, and then kind of took a backseat to Cromwell as time went on. So I think, just throwing this out there, I think if there's no Cromwell involved anymore in what's going on with the English Civil War, and I'll say more directly, I imagine he would still be involved in some degree or some sort of rabble-rousing way, but it's kind of difficult to do when you're across the pond. I imagine Fairfax would remain the principal leader, and he would probably have led the effort a bit differently, which I think in turn would have big effects on how the war would play out. If Charles I does not get executed, I think that is a very interesting road to go down. Let's say he flees to France and he is trying to kind of like rule in exile while the Civil War is going on. What do we think about that possibility?
Well, I think that really, I think it makes for kind of an interesting dynamic because, this is a time period when we're right in the middle of all these wars of religion. You have, Catholics versus the various flavors of Protestantism, especially in England. This is a pre-Acts of Union, England and Scotland. They're ruled by the same monarchs, but they have different numbers. So, Charles I's dad was James I of England and James VI of Scotland.
Yeah.
So you have all this weird, they rule the same territory, but it's under ostensibly multiple different kingdoms. So, the idea of a Charles in exile in France, there's I think that's going to make the English Civil War much more kind of strategically classical English. The English were always fighting against, essentially on two fronts, with Scotland in the north and France in the south. The old alliance before England and Portugal was Scotland and France. So I think you'll see, the focus might be much less overt in England, but I think you're going to see much more sort of attempts at invasions from Scotland, French, armies and some French forces that he can rally moving up to Scotland or coming across the pond. I think tactically you get into a much different war than you see just with basically the industrialized sort of commercial centers in England being parliamentarian versus sort of rural, pro-monarchy. I think it becomes much less guerrilla sort of hot pockets in England and much more of a sort of England versus Scotland versus France,
more of the same thing that's going on in Germany right now.
Yep.
Exactly what you see, like the Swedish with Gustavus Adolphus and all of that good stuff.
Yeah. And let's not forget, part of why King Charles was not popular was, who did he marry? He married Henrietta Maria, who is the daughter of Henry IV of France, and Henrietta was Catholic. So we already have this simmering religious disputes going on. And as we'll probably get into later on in this episode, Cromwell was pretty famously a Puritan. And as we were talking about off podcast before the show started, New England kind of owes its very existence to the fact that the English like to put people that they don't agree with or they don't like, they kind of like to have them into geographical dumping grounds. They had an entire continent as a prison colony, essentially, down under for our Australian listeners. I saw this joke one time where there was this person who tried to immigrate to Australia, and they asked him if he had a criminal record, and he was like, "Oh, you still need one of those to get in?" All right, now that I've offended pretty much everybody in Australia, I'm sure they get it all the time, but moving on. So, Cromwell being in New England, and New England kind of owing its existence to the fact that the Puritans and various other religious minorities kind of were essentially charitably sent off there. England was pretty much, all right, if you don't want to practice our religion, we're okay with that. Just practice it over there. Kind of like with Stalin when he said, hey, you can have freedom of speech in Siberia.
Well, one of the interesting things, the reason like it is so hard for some people to conceive of Rhode Island being an actual state.
Yes.
Because one of the reasons
explain this to me.
Because a lot of the borders of the New England colonies are because Britain basically considered anybody who wasn't in line with the official Church of England line as, Puritans, send them over. They did not pay attention to the different sects within this religious grouping. So a lot of these different small little colonies are offshoots of one or the other. So that's kind of why you saw, and once you get into the American Revolution, you have these small little states that owe their history to offshoots of different Protestant denominations. They're all independent colonies, and that is one of the if you look historically, the big populous states were your Pennsylvanias and your Virginias, and your small states were, with the exception of Delaware, all New England, and they were the ones pushing for kind of a Senate style representation.
Yeah, and I think that gets into kind of an interesting sort of setup for just, putting aside kind of the English side of this fork, I guess, for right now, that gets into an interesting sort of exploration of what exactly Cromwell would be getting into if he lands in, Connecticut. So, he leaves England for Connecticut in 1634. You figure he lands in 1634, maybe early 1635. Connecticut at this point is one of several colonies that are all kind of in this area. New Haven is its own separate colony at this point. Connecticut's right next door to it. You've also got New Amsterdam at the time before it's New York, down, across the Hudson River and on Long Island, right across the bay. But this is right before one of the formative conflicts for the development of sort of Connecticut into the sort of quote unquote New England that we understand, which is the Pequot War. So the Pequot War, to give a real Cliff's Notes version, basically it's a war between Connecticut and some of the other New England colonies against French and Dutch-backed Native American tribes. That's just one of these many series of wars over, territory, colonial governance, things like that. But this war happens between 1636 and 1638. So this is right when Cromwell gets in. So you kind of imagine that in some way, shape, or form, because he does have some military experience. He's a former MP, so he's in a position that is going to allow him, even when he gets to Connecticut, he's going to be at least a person of some note. So it's not hard to think that he's going to have some sort of leadership position of command in the Pequot War. Does that then make him, a potential candidate for colonial governor of Connecticut or, some, basically bigwig over there? That I think puts up kind of an interesting, especially when you factor in the sort of Puritan nature of Connecticut, that creates this really interesting dynamic between the sort of, at this point, still strongly Catholic at least leanings in parts of the Stuart monarchy's control, especially in Ireland and Scotland, versus this Puritan Connecticut that's, governed by a guy in our timeline who is, a devout, hardcore Protestant Puritan, strongly anti-Catholic.
And I mean, this is part of when I was doing some research and digging around. We'll throw this in the show notes. I don't really want to get into this too far into the weeds on this, but there's this whole arc that somebody established. I think it's called Puritan World. It's like this alternate history that talks about how, and it's a slightly different fork than the one we're discussing, but it's essentially the same thing, where we essentially get a Handmaid's Tale prequel in the real world, starting with a Puritan theocracy in North America as a result of Cromwell coming over. I don't want to get too far into the weeds on that, because I'm just going to say this strikes me as much more fanciful and not as reality based as what we tend to do here on A Fork in Time. But we'll throw it in the show notes just so you guys can look into it and toss around those possibilities in your head.
What I'm going to try and kind of ask a question I know the answer to, because I realize we do have a lot of Americans who do not know much of anything about England had a civil war too. So Cromwell's main role in the English Civil War was developing the new model army, was taking a group and starting a professional army out of nothing. That actually sounds a little bit like George Washington or a von Steuben, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
So it sounds like his skill set. And the other part of it is he doesn't have Fairfax, not necessarily getting in the way, but there's no power struggle. There's no his ascendancy to it. He just shows up and has a bunch of colonists, and I'm just, comically picturing those giant blunderbuss muskets with those huge funnels.
The kitchen sink guns.
Yes. And he comes in, and the colony he just arrived in is under attack. And he's already got in our timeline, he's got a skill, regardless of his Puritan conversion or anything like that. Hey, he knows how to get people together. He knows how to build a fighting force. And it's distinctly possible that he can really, we're going to go back to England. And by the way, hey, we're kind of ignoring a nation in England. We haven't talked about Ireland. I think that's very important. But his absence from the English Civil War, we'll get back to, but his presence in the Pequot War, I think, can really change what happens there.
I think that has a big possible impact. And like remembering in our timeline as a backdrop, England conquers New Amsterdam in 1664. And at this point, New Amsterdam is basically 10,000 people, roughly, kind of huddled on the south shore of Manhattan. So it doesn't become, and also considering the fact that the Dutch basically got the island of Manhattan for a few beads, I think, something along those lines. So we have an extremely early, essentially hamlet, village that gets conquered, and the Dutch give up their claims to New Amsterdam, what becomes New York, Manhattan, the whole entire colony, and England gives up South America, Suriname, I think, in South America, and some East Indies islands too, as a result of this. So if we have a more aggressive Cromwell in the Pequod Wars and very militarily skilled, that could lead to some maybe concessions that don't end up happening, perhaps.
Yeah, and I think it's also interesting to set up, kind of what the opposition, sort of the bipolar across the pond would look like, because you're going to have a very prominent, especially with a figure like Cromwell leading this very organized military force. You imagine the colony of Connecticut and later the sort of New England Confederacy is going to be more attractive as a place for some Puritan-minded folks who otherwise maybe would have been in the English Civil War. Not, I'm not saying it's going to be thousands and thousands of people, but
to put a fine point on something, we specifically talked, I think, Connecticut sees some pretty serious territorial expansion under this scenario. I think they go up to the Hudson.
That's exactly what I think. And I think Long Island becomes, what we now understand as New York City is essentially kind of split in two, because you've got sort of the western side, and then Long Island is part of Connecticut. So you already have, at this time, this is already somewhat well commercialized by the Dutch. So you have an attractive commercial center that is already there for Connecticut to start making money, start consolidating. I think that's really where you're going to get a lot of the emigration from these predominantly parliamentarian areas of England, which are all the commercial centers, the ports, the trading areas anyway. So I think that's where it kind of gets into the interesting, okay, some of these Puritans and some of the more parliamentarian minded folks are going to go to Connecticut maybe, instead of being in the English Civil War and sort of the aftermath. So it's kind of, I wonder if, regardless of sort of the exact path that the English Civil War takes, I wonder if the eventual compromise and settlement, regardless of how many heads start rolling and which monarch ends up coming back or being restored, I think you see at least some level of less concessions to the parliament, because there's going to be, not necessarily a dramatically weaker parliamentarian, faction, but a very different prioritized.
It's going to be different priorities, and it's going to be different emphasis. And before I hop into another issue across the pond that I want to throw out there again.
Yeah, you know what? Let's all agree. Let's settle America right now. We're going to settle this side, and then we'll go over.
I agree, because there's a big issue that I want to bring up that's across the pond, but let's stop by in America first. So what I was thinking through was, because if we're expanding Connecticut's borders, essentially, hashtag make Connecticut great again.
Maybe just hashtag make Connecticut great.
Yeah. That's like, we need to give them Manhattan, because they are not great right now. They're not.
Let's
offense, Connecticut. You're middling.
It's what I believe the kids, Chris, would call that mid.
I'm okay with that.
So anyway, as part of making Connecticut great, the thing is we're as you mentioned earlier, Chris, a big part of the colonial lines being drawn were due to religious settlement and differences. So I was thinking, okay, what was New York mainly in our timeline? And in our timeline, just from the little research I've been doing, it seems like New York was much more religiously mixed based on different areas of geography. And we have the Reformed Church, the Dutch Reformed Church, essentially Calvinists, located in the Hudson River Valley, where the Dutch had settled. We have like Lutherans, German Reformed Church, Congregationalists, French Huguenots, kind of like all in different areas of New York. So if we have a Connecticut, Puritan essentially culture, which, as a little historical side note, Puritan churches were a lot different. If you go to any like kind of non-denominational church today, Puritan churches were quite a bit different. They had this whole thing called a meeting house, and it was run rather differently, which would have kind of interesting, I would think, like, implications for religious life moving forward. But essentially, the point I'm trying to get at here is a broader Puritan presence in the early American colonies. My perception is, and either of you can correct me on this, my perception is by the time of the 7 Years' War, and certainly by the American Revolution, the Puritans and that influence was very much on the decline. It was very much not as important. So, what would the implication be if we have a leader like Oliver Cromwell, who is, as we know, rather, I don't know if I'll necessarily say fanatical, but very devoted to his religious cause, to his political causes, essentially being a governor of a much stronger Connecticut. What would that lead to in terms of the history of America?
The first question I would throw out is this. I think you got two different paths. You've got two different traditions within this group. One being kind of the Max Weber, like Protestant work ethic capitalist. And then you've got the theocrats. And I think with the inclusion of New York, I think you have the city become what it does somewhat in our lifetime, in our timeline, being these are the capitalists. These are the people that don't necessarily take the religion to that extreme. And the kind of hinterlands of Connecticut are the more, what you're picturing more the, hey, remember when the Puritan or Cromwell took over England, they banned Christmas.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I think maybe what you would, just to kind of get one of the things Dylan was a little talking about is, do you have two different colonies develop here? Do they split? And this is a legitimate question. Which of those traditions does Cromwell follow? Does he follow kind of a political economy tradition, or does he follow a theocratic tradition?
Yeah, I kind of wonder if, to pick up on sort of where you're going, I do think you would see sort of Connecticut, New York, or Puritan New York, just for the lack of a better word to call the Long Island and all that. I do think that would be the sort of commercial center. So I wonder, because Cromwell, I think, is more of a political animal in this.
He's much more political, I feel,
than a pure ideologue,
mm-hmm.
because he's got
and for Americans or anybody else, because of where he is, because he is in the English Civil War and in the times of the 30 Years' War, we don't see these two things as separate. We can't understand these two separate things. But I think,
yeah, exactly,
yeah.
So
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if, I do think it would at some point dovetail into either two different colonies, or essentially like, a Connecticut colony with almost kind of a quote unquote sort of free city kind of idea for Long Island, where, the main Connecticut government is much more, puritanical and conservative, but they have this kind sort of, some of the super hardcore guys are going to call it the sort of American Gomorrah or American Sodom,
American Babylon.
Yeah,
that's already how we look at Long Island. Go ahead.
but I do think Connecticut is going to be a much more strictly religious observance place. This is 50 years before the Salem witch trials. So this is very much like, this is Arthur Miller's The Crucible, probably to some extent on steroids, in terms of how widespread it is.
So maybe Cromwell comes over during the Pequot War, and I'm envisioning kind of, he uses Connecticut as the springboard, but if he, being the political animal, he plants his own flag and kind of creates a Manhattan, Kings County, Queens County, Suffolk, Norfolk. So basically what we picture of New York City sans the Bronx plus Long Island as his, where he is, where the colony he founds in and of himself. And that's kind of the mercantilist colony. Is that kind of what you're thinking?
I think that's probably fair. And let's not forget the fact that the reason Cromwell wanted to come over was, he was already a MP. He was a member of parliament at this point in our timeline, but he was wanting to come over here in America because he and his family fell on pretty hard times economically. So I think he would be pretty pragmatist, pretty economically minded, and also concerned about, cementing his political power. Yeah. As such, I don't think he's going to be as interested in being an ideologue. Mm-hmm. And he would probably be fine because, again, he does have those very strongly held puritanical beliefs. But I think if he has some sort of power share agreement, or like what Dylan said, like a free city of some kind, he'd be very, very happy with doing that, because that essentially sets him up that, he has his own area of influence, and he's able to really strengthen that economy and build that up. And whatever they're doing up in their Connecticut hills, he's like, you know what, guys, you do your religious thing, I'll do my economic thing. Well, and I think that's a very viable path.
Yeah, and at the same time, also the aftermath of the Pequot War is what gives rise to, what develops into our understanding of quote unquote New England as kind of a thing. The Pequot War is and the acquisition of sort of New York versus Dutch New Amsterdam. That's what gives rise to this. Actually, one of the earliest colonial sort of defense Commonwealth treaties.
It wasn't Robert Kraft.
It is Super Bowl weekend, so we have to talk football.
Hey, speaking of football, we are living in a timeline where New York could actually be Patriots fans.
Yeah. And I think
no.
Chris was like, no.
Well, the New York football team would just be the New York Buffaloes.
I mean, no, yeah, maybe, because again, what you're going to have, you're going to have what we consider New York be a separate political entity from Connecticut.
True. At least
just and culturally, this is going to be very, very different than New England.
Yes, but what I'm getting at is this: if you have Cromwell. One is a political animal who's already been an MP, had success in the Pequot War. He's going to be the natural person to try and get this defense sort of assistance treaty for a kind of a version of New England. If you then add that in with, if he's got a sort of personal political center of power in Long Island, I think the idea of a sort of colonial defense treaty is going to be much more of a sort of not a completely centralized government, but it is going to be a much more early version of a federalized system of government that becomes more in fashion in the American Civil War. I think New England under a Cromwell becomes more of a progenitor of that kind of thing.
I'm not even sure if it becomes a post-Civil War. It definitely becomes closer to a nation, because I mean, if you're, looking at what was the one thing, the only thing that really was supposed to be the job of the federal government under the initial, even Articles of Confederation, it was defense.
National defense.
Yep. That's exactly where I'm going. So I think you're going to see a version of that under Cromwell in this timeline in New England.
Now, that's interesting. How does that play out when it comes to the 7 Years' War? By the way, I think right now, just looking at some time stuff, we might have to do the other side of the pond as a separate.
Yeah, that's fine.
Because we've gone down something here.
Well, I think we've gone down something really fascinating. Yeah.
But so if you have a NETO, a New England Treaty Organization.
Oh God.
I'm like, where are you going with this?
Yeah, yeah, there it is. How does that play out? Let's assume for a second we're keeping everything else the same. How does that play out when it comes to the 7 Years' War or the French and Indian War, when we are fighting in upstate, when we are fighting in Pennsylvania, when we have all of these actual combat? Does that mean that the colonists are better prepared and, frankly, less dependent on England to send troops over? And does that mean they take on more political independence? Or does that mean England just lets them ride more because it doesn't have the expenditure to defend them?
Well, here's the thing, and not to necessarily walk back what we're thinking about, maybe making this a two-parter, but I think we could still cover it this episode, and here's why. I feel like a lot of what happens in the 7 Years' War is dependent upon what we set up and how we kind of tie that loose end over back in Europe. So, I mean, I'm down either way, but I'm just going to say, for the record, however, all the dynamics that are going on with England, because we're basically going to be trying to assume that England is set up a certain way for the 7 Years' War in our alternate timeline, but we haven't done that work yet.
Nope, I get it. So we have a NATO, or it's a thing.
You know what? I think that sounds amazing.
We have a Puritan version of Bill Belichick's weird jersey thing that he always wore coaching. That's what we have.
Like a monk habit.
Yes, the sleeveless hoodie with buckled shoes and the monk hat.
I mean, just look up parliamentarian fashion in the 1650s, and that's what you got.
Yeah, I don't think my local dry cleaner has enough starch for that.
Except with the sleeves cut off.
Yes, with the sleeves cut off, because it's New England and we don't feel cold up there.
Exactly.
But so we've got that. Let's go to Britain. Let's play out the Civil. Let's play out basically the what in our timeline turns out to be the Civil War. Let's do the reign of Charles I.
Yeah,
and see where we're at.
Yes, exactly. And this is what I wanted to hop into. This can probably be more of what would be called a side quest, I guess. But this is what I've been kind of waiting to drop before, maybe we get into that specifically. But I feel like with a lack of Cromwell back on the other side of the pond, we have a big change. Well, I don't know if it would necessarily be a huge change, but I think there will be a change of some kind that we'll talk through about a little island to the west, the Emerald Isle, called Ireland. Cromwell had a pretty big role to play in quashing Confederate Ireland. And we're not talking about the American Civil War, happening a couple hundred years later. We're talking about an Ireland that basically, in the wake of the English Civil War, said, you know what? We're Catholic. We don't want you guys anymore. We're out.
In the middle, towards the end, because Cromwell starts campaigning over there. And, hey, let's bring it back to New England. If you spend as much of your life around Boston Irish people as I do, they still talk about They still talk about Cromwell in the
Cromwell
same.
Is basically Hitler.
He is their Hitler. Yes.
Yeah, Cromwell is hated and despised. So if we don't have a Cromwell that's messing around there, and let's, for tying up the thread that I was talking about earlier, let's assume, and you guys can disagree on this assumption, but let's assume that Fairfax retains, control of the military, substantial influence in what's going on with the parliamentarian forces. In my brief research, Fairfax does not seem to me really, I don't even see really anything that talks about what he thinks about Ireland or what his opinion would be at all.
Well,
do we assume Ireland happens, like Confederate Ireland still? I personally feel yes. And do we assume that Charles I still loses? And if he does, what does Fairfax do?
I think
those are a few questions.
I don't think he loses. I think if we have because keeping this in mind, if Cromwell comes to the United States 34, 35, he is setting up, New Babylon. or New Jerusalem. New Jerusalem.
Yep.
I think that is what New York is. New Jerusalem.
Ooh, interesting.
But he sets it up. And I think, we talked a little bit about the king giving him permission to move, but I think if you have a mercantilist state set up in the New York area, I think that is a pressure valve for a lot of the more dynamic parliamentarians. And if it becomes kind of standard that the king encourages you to emigrate, because if he does that, because the other part of it is this, right? To kind of touch a little bit of what you were getting at, Evan. The Ulster plantation starts under James, and what the Ulster plantation is it is explicitly an effort to settle Ireland with Scots. If you ever hear somebody refer to Scots-Irish, that's what it is. And this was an attempt to defuse Scottish issues by giving them land in Ireland, and therefore, hey, creating an issue that we still have to deal with.
We got Northern Ireland as a result of this.
That is where all of this comes from.
Mm-hmm.
Shout out Matt McQuaid. I will tell you about this next week. So if it becomes like just the policy of the British that if you're troublesome, here's some land somewhere else, go.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have? I think you still have Charles trying to centralize his authority, trying to kind of, become a divine ruler. Does the opposition to him play out the same way if you've almost got the cream of their crop being shipped over?
They're all shipped
to Massapequa.
Yeah, I don't think so. And here's the reason why. We have precedent, essentially, from our timeline. Fairfax in our timeline essentially kind of became, I don't want to necessarily invoke like the lost cause thing in a wrong way. He became the exact opposite of that. He pretty much was like, you know what? We fought for things, on the parliamentarian side, but when, Charles II came to the throne, Fairfax basically retired from public life. And he's like, yep, you know what? I'm out. I did not like what that Cromwell guy did. I was for it before I was against it, kind of thing. And he was spared the fate of a lot of the other parliamentarians that, in wake of Charles II ascending the throne. Fairfax basically just kind of rode off into the sunset because he, had his reasons, of course, for being involved in the English Civil War and in fighting. It was almost kind of like a General Lee sort of situation to me, where not necessarily geographical, because, of course, General Lee was more dedicated to his state versus the federal government. Fairfax was more dedicated to the parliamentarian side versus supporting the king. But he was definitely not someone who was in any way, shape, or form anywhere close to the fanaticism of a Cromwell. So because of that, in our timeline, we basically see Fairfax being able to live out a peaceful rest of his days, due to his lack of, I don't want to say lack of conviction, but compared to Cromwell, I would say certainly. I think that
his lack of fanaticism.
His lack of fanaticism, for sure.
Like any Patriots fan after this season.
Right. So I think there could be, I think probably the end result of, the English Civil War. I mean, Charles I in exile, like we established at the start of this episode, in exile in France. Probably, I would imagine there would be some sort of, maybe some tweaks or some changes.
Does he go into exile, or does the Cavalier side win the Civil War?
I think personally, it's a very, this is kind of into the great person versus forces of history argument. I honestly, and just from my understanding of the English Civil War, I personally feel Cromwell himself was such a singular force and personality in this particular time frame to where if you take him out of the equation, I don't think there's the juice. I don't think there's the motivation. I don't think there's the drive to do everything that Cromwell ended up doing and beheading King Charles I. I don't personally see that happening. So I think it is incredibly likely that the royalist forces, if they don't end up outright winning, they at least secure some sort of concessions or some sort of, like, pretty much I don't see a Republican England happening at all.
I think it's
I
going to
see
be
a modified monarchy.
Yeah.
In fact, even maybe more of an absolutist monarchy, but with different parameters.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think, and I think you're right, Evan. I think part of it is the impact of Cromwell. Maybe not necessarily, I do think his force of will and his personality shouldn't be discounted, but also his creation of the new model army. This is not a English style of fighting at this point. This is much more continental Europe, pike shot, close formations. It's almost an Alexander the Great phalanx kind of thing, which is very good against the way that the English would fight, which is a lot like the Scottish and the French, which involves a lot of horses. So I think, to make a long story short, I do think Charles would end up winning, because I don't think you would see the new model army as this sort of force that just had the magic bullet against cavalry charges and things like that. I don't think the parliamentarians would, just kind of disappear into the sunset. I almost think it would be kind of akin to go further back into English history, the series of Barons' Wars against the Angevin kings, especially John and some of his children, where you have these continual defeats of these kind of smaller rebellion wars, but the long run is it's much less of one big war that determines the fate of the country and a series of sort of periodic parliamentary rebellions depending on the state of the crown.
Do you think this might just lead to another Magna Carta?
That's what I was thinking, honestly.
Yeah, I think maybe not with this king necessarily. I think Charles, coming from his dad, the Scottish Parliament was much more kind of rubber stamp, see all of the infighting scenes from Braveheart to get an idea of what that was like. So I think Charles is too much of his dad's son, too used to the sort of Scottish parliamentary rubber stamp style. I think once you get maybe another monarch or two down the line that becomes more accustomed to the new post-Civil War status quo of ruling in an English court, then I think you may see sort of a new Magna Carta style thing. I'm thinking sometime maybe around like the 1680s, 1690s, as we get closer to 1700, which then gets interesting because you start getting into the burgeoning of the Enlightenment era, and sort of what does that end up playing into whatever this sort of new Magna Carta kind of looks like.
So what we've got in the, I guess, the English situation is Charles defeats the Rising, defeats the parliamentarians. It probably comes to some kind of political settlement. You do not have Cromwell's campaign in Ireland. In fact, I feel like for the future, the king is going to become very popular in Ireland. It may actually, we'll get into some of that. But I'm trying to kind of pull it back together because we did talk about a two-parter. We are at kind of a point. So how far do we think Charles himself rules if he doesn't meet any unfortunate ends?
Untimely demise. That is a good question.
And that plus, are there any other things we need to be thinking about? So, for example, by the way, let's just throw this in there. One of the things about, I hate doing this, and I told us not to do it, and I'm going to go ahead and do it anyway. One of the things about what Cromwell in this alternate timeline did in Connecticut is he created an army out of nothing. He created an army out of a militia. Do we think that Charles having an army now plays in the 30 Years' War? Because he actually had to build this thing up, and does that play into anything? And this is another serious question. What side is he on?
Interesting.
He's a predominantly Catholic person, but his country is Protestant. I mean, I'm
one of his countries is Protestant.
One of his countries,
because you have to remember, this is before the Acts of Union, so this is still it is a kingdom.
Well, no, two of his countries are relatively popularly Protestant.
Yeah,
I would say England and Scotland.
Yeah, Scotland is much more probably closer to the middle. But this is not a unitary state, so we have to account for the differences.
And does he I mean, I'm just throwing this out there because I'm the crazy person that sees other things going on and wonders if there's an involvement. He may, what is the possibility of him taking up a Richelieu stand or a counter to Richelieu, who's kind of looking at everything and saying, you know what, even though, Richelieu, French cardinal, in charge about this time, or an advisor at this time, and what he does is he looks at the situation and says, you know what, France may be predominantly a majority Catholic country. The ruling class is Catholic. But let's support the Protestants in the 30 Years' War because we hate the Habsburgs, and that's who they're fighting. So to counter that, do you have a Catholic or a Protestant nation in England supporting Catholic forces, the Habsburg forces, as a counterweight to France?
And if I may throw in another monkey wrench into this equation, we have, as a result of the outcome of the English Civil War, as we have it in our timeline, we have two pretty famous people who kind of come to prominence, and one ended up becoming more prominent than the other. A philosopher by the name of Thomas Hobbes, and his philosophy, as he elucidates in the book Leviathan, he rejects the divine right of kings theory, right? And the other person is John Lilburne, who vigorously defended this whole idea of the divine right of kings. I feel like as a result of what we have going on here with our alternate timeline, I feel like this gives the divine right of kings sort of school of thought. I think it kind of gives it a little bit of a new lease on life, personally. I feel like what happens in our timeline gives way to a Hobbesian sort of what ends up leading towards a more constitutional monarchy, as we see in our timeline. Still, Leviathan, of course, was not at all a constitutional monarchy, strong parliamentarian sort of work. It still had a very strong king figure, at the top. And it argued vigorously against this whole, idea of republicanism. But it was definitely less of a, you are king and we should follow you just because you were born into that position and that you have God on your side. That's kind of it. The founding fathers used a lot of Hobbesian logic to kind of eventually develop their American system of government. But Hobbes was far from a Republican. So just throwing this in here, I don't think the Hobbesian school of thought has as much sway and influence. And thus, if we have some sort of Magna Carta agreement as a result of the English Civil War, we could have a more enduring sense of, hey, monarchy is good. Having a strong central monarch is important. God gives him the right to rule. And that has a big ripple effect on what happens down the line with the 7 Years' War. Chris is looking at me very confused right now.
I mean, I think 7 Years' War and all of the other wars of the 18th century are all kind of an outgrowth of both Westphalia and Richelieu. In other words, the idea of nation states as primary actors and the interest of the nation state being of primary importance. Kind of what I was talking about, how Richelieu, literally a Catholic priest, a Catholic bishop, is backing the Protestants in the 30 Years' War. And I think, regardless of, whatever internal justifications anybody uses, I think we are now seeing, we haven't changed anything in terms of European politics in this timeline from our timeline. We're beginning to see states become the primary actors and the interest of those states as the primary driving forces. So we could argue that, whoever is in charge of Britain and England and all of these different entities interacts differently, but I don't see a connection yet between the justification that they use to sit on the throne and their actions in a European balance of power situation.
Yeah, and I think there's, just to kind of throw this to, I guess, counterbalance your sort of counter Richelieu point, Charles I had a very initially tumultuous, but later very strong relationship with his wife, who is a French royal family member. So I think partially because of the aftermath of the Civil War, just from a pure tactical perspective, I wonder if there's going to be a significant involvement in the 30 Years of War. It's kind of one of those things, you don't go renovating your house after you just busted up all your furniture and have to put it back together.
Hey, let's go ahead and throw this in there. A English version of the Blue Legion. To reference the Senhuro episode we are going to come back to pretty soon.
Yeah, and I picture whatever help is sent actually coming in on the French side.
Okay.
To just because of the ties between
because of the ties, yeah.
Because of the family ties. I don't think that's going to do a whole lot in the grander long-term, historical anonymity or animosity between England and France on the sort of geopolitical stage. But I think for this short period, obviously once you get monarchs down the road, the marriages and the family stuff changes. I think you're going to, whatever help does go, I think you're going to see on the side of the French.
Okay. I think that's a very interesting possibility. Now that we're talking about it, once England, once the Stuarts adopt the policy of, hey, let's export troublesome people. What better place to export troublesome people than a war zone?
Well, and that's also going to be attractive for some of the more, I hate to use a word like bloodthirsty, but it's the word I'm going to use. The members of the parliamentarian faction who would rather fight somebody than do nothing.
Let's say the rabble rousers.
Yeah, and the ones who think maybe I can use this to my advantage 15 years down the road when the next opportunity arises. So I think that's where English involvement in the 30 Years of War would come in.
Okay.
Sort of from that perspective, which I think that then throws out some interesting possibilities for what happens later on down the line in, like I was saying, the third or the fourth version of this little a shorter Civil War spat that we've been through in this timeline.
Mm-hmm.
As usual, I like to throw questions out and then promptly not answer them.
Well, I mean, I understand. I like what you're doing with that. I think it does make a lot of sense. The last thing I'm going to say, and I think we should kind of wrap it up. We're close to the end of Charles.
Yep.
But I'm going to go ahead and ask, whatever involvement there is, it helps center the Stuart monarchy. It helps continue to attach the Stuart monarchy to Europe in a way that in English history is always kind of a debate.
Yeah.
Mhm.
But the more involvement they have on the continent, I agree that it's not going to, do any. I don't think it changes what happens because, I mean, everybody in Europe is exhausted of fighting at this point when it comes to an end in 1648.
Mhm.
But I think whatever tradition there is, and I think while you're right, Dylan, that the family relationship is going to end when there's a different monarch there, I do think it's an interesting possibility. I mean, maybe you kind of see, and we'll develop this more when we get into to further episodes. I'm thinking maybe you actually see Great Britain, England, the Stuarts, and the French monarchy almost coming to some pact together that the French aren't going to really try and go to the Americas.
Mhm.
They're not going to become a maritime power, but Great Britain will not try and interfere in the Low Countries.
Yeah.
Mhm.
I can see something like that,
Yeah,
especially
I can
because,
definitely see that.
yeah, especially because France, especially at this point, during the 30 Years of War and all of this, the antagonist in the Low Countries is Spain.
Mhm.
So France is going to naturally want to have somebody that they can not necessarily trust, at least not worry about when they're already, at least the perception in the French, mind is going to be they're already cornered in by Spain on a side and a half, two sides. Plus the the upstart Germans who are, starting to make all these German noises about, Confederation and all that.
Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
And I think there's a really interesting possibility of, Richelieu in France and Charles in England being the modern statesman.
Well, and especially with Henrietta
Mhm.
being his wife, who refused multiple attempts to convert her. So I think she makes a natural go-between between Charles and Richelieu in the French court.
But I'm thinking about these two countries or these two leaders
Courts, maybe.
as being the first modern nation state leaders.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And that being a huge advantage
Yeah.
when it comes to trying to deal with absolutist people that do not recognize, and so to kind of finish it up, I think there's an interesting future for the idea of a separation of a church and a state, where the state is the power, the church is whatever you want to do, and that is how you can have a Catholic safely close to the King of England.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And it changes, the whole relation of, absolutism versus, the nature of
Mhm.
a parliament, the estates, the advisory nature of elected government too.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
But all of that is for the future.
All that is for the future, guys. I do think we have a potential very viable, episode or a couple of episodes for the future to dive more down into this little
Mhm.
arc that we've established. We just seem to be doing that with a lot of our topics recently. We get started on an area, think it might be one episode. We end up making it a whole separate arc. And I would
Yep.
love to explore this again with you guys sometime.
So-
But in the meantime, I have a couple of rather small, unimportant, and more on the pop culture side of things before we finish things off. But before I just toss those in, you guys have anything else you want to talk about before we wrap up?
I've got the standard closing, but we'll do that after.
Sounds good. So, two things that I'm just going to shotgun right away. What happens with the ship Oliver Cromwell, and what happens with Oliver Cromwell's head? Because it just seems to be a thing that comes up in history. Famous people, Richard Nixon's head in Futurama, Walt Disney. And of course, in our timeline, Oliver Cromwell was disinterred by King Charles II, and his head was put on public display. I don't think anything happens to our good friend's head in this timeline, and his body is laid to rest and not disinterred. No dismemberment whatsoever.
There may be a bust of Oliver Cromwell somewhere on Wall Street.
Yeah.
In this timeline.
Mm-hmm. I would think so. And then the ship Oliver Cromwell was a ship that was commissioned for the Connecticut State Navy in 1776, and then Britain captured it in the War for Independence in 1779, and eventually made its way back to the U.S. in 1781. I think the fate of the Oliver Cromwell ship in our timeline is going to be determined in a future episode where we talk about what a possible War for Independence would look like, if it even happens in our timeline. But those will be issues that we can dive into another day. So without further ado, Chris, how about you take us home?
Just want to encourage everybody. We are going to try getting the website back up and running. That might be a good place to look for, updates about the podcast. We also have started saying that we want to revisit episodes. I'm going to go ahead and say right now, Helena, please come on, tell us what we did wrong here. I'm really interested to hear somebody who, actually really, like, a couple of times I kind of pulled us back and said, hey, listen, we have a lot of Americans that do not like intrinsically know this history, but we are all Americans. And I'd really love to hear from people who grew up with that sense of what the English Civil War was, or anybody else who has any kind of really strong ideas about something we left off.
We love your feedback. We want to hear how we got it wrong or what we might have gotten right.
So, just, to close out, if someone should come upon a fork in the road, what should they do?
Figure out a way to put it in the Bass Pro Shop.
Does Oliver Cromwell have a bust at the Bass Pro Shop Pyramid?
No, I was going to say Charles I gives the King of France a pyramid-shaped fixture to put over the Louvre.
No. Oliver Cromwell's head is disinterred.
No, wait, no, I know.
It's buried.
It's the secret crystal skull in the Bass Pro Shop pyramid.
No.
Which is a real thing, by the way.
It gets disinterred and buried under the 50-yard line at Giant Stadium.
Oh my goodness gracious!
And then I think we're out.
I think we'll take the fork and if you see a fork in time, we'll take it, cutting it off right there, just like
just go somewhere weird.
All right, see y'all later, guys.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more and provide feedback by visiting our website at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Connect to us on Facebook at facebook.com/aforkintime or follow us on Twitter at AFIT Podcast. If you want to support the show financially, visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/aforkintime. We hope you will join us next time.